Hello beautiful people and welcome back to Angelic Embrace, where we document and narrate the glorious and life-changing near-death experiences from people all over the world. So sit back, relax, know that you are loved, and let's get into today's near-death experience story. Consider subscribing and watching to the end to find out what happens. I think it would be helpful if I told you a little bit about my life before I had the NDE so that you could have a better grasp on the entire significance of what took place. I am 26 years old at this point. When I was 22 years old, in April of 1998, I had my near-death experience. My struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder were to blame for this outcome. When I was a youngster, I was subjected to horrific abuse at the hands of both my father and my grandpa. In addition, I was a victim of child pornography and of prostitution when I was a child. For a good portion of my life, I struggled not just with an eating issue but also with alcohol and drug abuse. During the period that I was supposedly dead, I was working on getting my life in order. I had quit using drugs and addressing my eating issue when I was 19, but I didn't see much of an improvement in how I felt. I just moved my addiction to something else, and now I smoke obsessively. My unpleasant history prevented me from looking it in the face. If I didn't confront my history, I would never be able to properly live in the here and now. It is my belief that these forces were responsible for tearing me mentally and physically apart. My diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder came with a number of side effects, one of which was a difficulty to fall or stay asleep. I used to have trouble sleeping. I had a terrible fear of going to sleep since for as long as I could remember, nightfall and sleep were synonymous with being abused. I noticed that I was sleeping less and less each night. Initially 5 hours, then 4, then 3, then 2, and then, if I was lucky, just 1 hour. Near the end, I was completely unable of falling or maintaining sleep. I basically did nothing to stop my downward spiral. I had lost the desire to live, and as a result, I had begun to starve myself and not drink nearly enough water either. After not getting any sleep for 7 consecutive nights, I found myself in the emergency room with a serious illness. My mother was informed by the physicians that they were uncertain as to whether or not I would survive. She did not reveal this information to me until a number of years had passed. The only thing that stayed with me was that I was in the hospital room. Suddenly, I was enveloped by this brilliant light that was nearly golden in appearance and had a yellowish-white hue. It was brighter further off into the distance, and I appeared to be seeing this light overlaid over the scenery outside the window. After that, I felt myself being drawn toward this light in some mysterious way. My heart was filled with an overwhelming sense of love and tranquility that words cannot adequately describe. It was nothing short of joy. My beating heart was full of life. It seemed as though I had cold rivers of water that never stopped pouring through it, and the sensation was one of the most thrilling feelings ever. I wished the sensation would last forever, and I can honestly say that it was the first time in my life that I felt genuine contentment. I was captivated and in this state of pleasure for what seemed like an extremely long time but was actually only a brief period of time. It seemed as though all of the information in the world was being channeled through me, and that nothing was being withheld. I felt an overwhelming sense of love, and the answers to all of my questions kept coming. The next thing I knew, I heard a nurse yelling at me. She sounded so enraged, and I could see her as clearly as if I were gazing down from a position on the ceiling that was close to one of the corners of the room. She was grabbing me and attempting to administer some medication to me at the same time. I was ignoring her and not reacting to her. That she was making an effort to get me back did not make me pleased. Finally, I was able to get back into my body in some way, but after that point, I have no recollection of the events that took place. That was the point at which things began to take an odd turn. For the rest of the day, I hung precariously close to the edge of mortality. The first experience was in the early afternoon. It made me feel terrible to be back here. During the same time period, I had the ability to sense particular objects. When I looked at my grandma, I could sense the torment that her life's experiences had brought on her. I was able to feel the shame that she carried from an abortion that she had in the past, as well as the way that she buried that sorrow. I could feel and detect people's bad sentiments just by being in their presence. I had a figurative and literal understanding of what was going through their minds. I was able to see and feel my father through the wall that separated us in the room. He was surrounded by a significant deal of unfavorable energy at the moment. There was one other lady who comes to mind who was likewise quite pessimistic and negative. Despite the fact that it made me a little bit nervous, I found that this was extremely fascinating. I want to love each and every person. The most heartbreaking aspect was that some people did not want to receive this love. My mother, who had long since resolved many of her own psychiatric difficulties, and a male nurse who went by the name Michigan L were the only two persons whose energy I did not pick up as being negative. My mother had been through a lot herself. I could only pick up on affection and care for my well-being emanating from them. I recall even attempting to persuade someone that smoking was not what God intended them to do, and that because we are all so lovely and precious, it hurts God when we hurt ourselves and thus hurts God when we hurt ourselves. After my near-death experience, my mother subsequently characterized me as being similar to a flower child or a hippie. She still says this about me too, that I am highly sensitive. I remained in this state for a while, but eventually my own problematic background seized control of the situation. Because I hadn't fully dealt with the difficult problems of my past, I found myself being overwhelmed by them. This time, though, I had the distinct impression that the shame, grief, and repressed rage from the past were going to overwhelm me completely. And it did absorb everything of me. I fell back into my former state of gut-wrenching sadness when I started thinking about how unworthy I was of what I had experienced. I started thinking all of these dreadful, bad ideas about myself, and it caused me to sink further into my despair. My second near-death experience occurred at that time. This one was the worst thing that someone could possibly envision happening in their life. When it happened, I was laying in bed when all of a sudden I was surrounded by pitch blackness. There was no light, and there was nothing else. There was nothing. It wasn't as if I could see the darkness, rather, I was aware that it just there and that I was aware of its presence. Suddenly, there were these things surrounding me from every direction. I have no recollection of how many there were, but I had the impression that these were beings who had lived in the area for some time. They had been holding their breath until this point. When the entities first started pulling at me, I was taken to a realm where I felt complete and utter desperation. Even though there was nothing around me, I continued to live in this terrifying nothingness. The core of this emptiness was the fact that there was no God present in it. I want to emphasize how important that point is. It was worse than any kind of torment imaginable. There are no words that can adequately express how much it hurt. It was like a scene out of my darkest nightmare. The entities that were there informed me that everyone in my family would be damned to exist in the void, and that it would be my responsibility to bring about their demise. Even just having a conversation about it is a very difficult task. It was nothing but sheer horror. After what felt like an aeon had passed since my last memory, I found myself back where I started. I found myself back at the medical facility, inside of my body. When I attempted to tell other people about what had happened to me, they thought I was insane and I had to give up. At the time, I was engaged, so I discussed what had happened with my fiancé. I was unable to contain my excitement over it. He left me 2 weeks later. I had a recovery in terms of my body, but not my emotions. The aftermath of the second event continued to have a detrimental impact on me for a full 3 years. I lost all confidence in everything, but while I publicly declared that I did not believe in anything, privately I was terrified that I was destined for that horrible emptiness and that many other people were also headed in that direction. That is not something I believe any longer. The favorable results of the first one have been becoming more apparent over the course of the past year. I feel that the primary distinction between the two NDEs was the mental condition that I was in at the time. During the first one, I had the certainty in my soul that I was loved, I was prepared for a death without suffering, and it came to pass. During the second one, I let some of my worst anxieties come to the surface and play out in front of me. I believed there was no one who could help me and no hope for the future. I have no doubt in my mind that if I had asked for assistance during the second one, I would have received it. Instead, I had the impression that not even God could assist me, and as a result, I remained in that terrible location.